Welcome to the Mission Manhood podcast, where mature masculinity is celebrated and encouraged. My name is Angela Abide, and I will be your host. Every week or so, I sit down with a man who is in the men's movement, helping men grow and thrive in their masculinity, someone who is exhibiting characteristics of mature masculinity, or someone who has a perspective that might be beneficial for those who are seeking to grow and develop in that area. As a woman, I have a unique perspective as a mother and a therapist, and I hope to contribute to the conversation in those ways. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, I'm glad you're here. Today my guest is Esmond Baring of The Privileged Man. This episode feels like a prayer of hope for what is possible. Men and women allowing themselves to feel their own pain and witness the pain and longing of the other, to reconcile in love. I think it's unreasonable to expect that reconciliation is possible in our separation. It's in our coming together and learning to dance that we're going to be saved. Hello, Esmond.
Morning, Angela. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for joining me all the way around the world in Bali.
It's a pleasure.
I was wondering if you could tell everyone a little bit about what you do, your vision for your work.
Certainly. About a year and a half ago, I, with a business partner and a very old friend who comes from a similar background to me, we had the idea to put together a emotional health and healing platform called The Privileged Man. And the main focus and intention behind The Privileged Man is to create safe spaces for men to come together and learn to model new ways of healthy self-expression. And we believe that true privilege is remembering how to express our most true, vulnerable, and authentic selves, and creating the forums and spaces for men from all walks of life to come into online rooms and learn to speak from feeling rather than to talk about feelings. So we're moving away from the abstract, conceptual, intellectual understanding of emotion, which really isn't an understanding of emotion, to the raw, real expressions of feeling from the heart.
I heard you say that we're taught what it is to do human rather than be human. The being aspect has been lost. And you said that only looking inward can you discover that. Is that something that you've experienced that you're now hoping to share with other men?
Yeah, so, I'm 44 years old now, so I'm a long time out of the education system. I went to 2 boys' boarding schools from the age of 8 until 18 years old. And it wasn't until I was 36 years old that I came to a realization or an insight that I was living my life through the conditioning of my schooling system, of my country of birth, of the religion that I was exposed to. So I had no idea that my life was kind of being run like a dehumanized or automaton. And I think back to the education, certainly as I knew it, around the word indoctrination. So everything we're taught is indoctrinated into the operating system of the mind. And certainly from my own experience, it was more about learning about the world and how to operate within that, to succeed, to make money, and to prosper in that way. And what I've come to see is that from my perspective, I learned more about greed and fear from that indoctrination than I did about love, compassion, and understanding. And what seems to make an enormous amount of sense to me is if a schooling system can teach me about the being aspect of my humanity, so that I'm very consciously and deliberately choosing who I'm being when I go out to do my bidding and my doing, it might be an interesting way of looking at the world. I, as a man or as a boy, was taught, or I learned, to stifle, suppress, and shut my heart down from a very early age. And so I went out into the world to try and do the doing bit from a complete absence of feeling. And that absence of feeling, I created all sorts of mess and complications and struggle in my life. And the last 7 or 8 years has been a journey back into my true being and my core being, and unraveling layers of belief and layers of conditioning to recover the inner child, the spontaneous, the creative, the kind, the generous, the loving, the helpful aspects of my being that weren't there. And I say this, Angela, without blaming society, without blaming a schooling system, rather to try and look to the deeper unconscious conditioning that's holding so many men back from really, truly, and naturally and healthily expressing themselves, and suggesting that there are ways that we can remind men, teach men, and support men to remember the languages of their heart, and how that might contribute to the transformation of a society from the inside out.
I came across you sort of randomly on Instagram. I'd never heard your name. I'd never met you. And the first time I ever encountered you was in your beautiful voice asking this question. I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. And how does it feel as a woman being around a man, being a king, knowing himself and knowing his worth? I think I told you this before we recorded, that to me, it was almost like the voice of Father God. And it was like almost directly to me. And the woman that you asked the question of was Sasha Cobra. You were interviewing her for your podcast. And her response was such a perfect response. There was a little pause. And in this voice, she said, "It feels like a deep sigh in my body." And I felt that so strongly. And every time I look back at that, I posted it on my Instagram page, I get emotional. And just that beautiful connection between the masculine and feminine. And, what I'm trying to do here is to model that, the ability for the masculine and feminine to dance. And I thought that was such a beautiful example of it, of that sweetness of her femininity and the strength of your voice and your presence in that moment. And in listening to that episode, it answered a lot of the questions that I've been searching for. I sense that there's something in the current men's movement that's lacking, and it's the feminine. And I think as a reaction to the berating of masculinity, a lot of men are sort of striking out on their own and putting women in their place. They can love their woman, but that dance is missing sometimes. And so when I find an example of someone who is, as you said at the end of that episode, desiring conversations and desiring to work together, it just made me pay attention and want to know more about you. So I appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Angela. And that particular clip did come across in a very powerful way, which wasn't intended in any way, but the way it was captured, it did. And what I love about Sasha is her recognition and her appreciation and her reverence for the fullness and the depth of our aspects of being as men and women, and that potential to integrate and embody those polarities within ourselves. Sasha is a sweet, gentle, kind, and powerful, fierce, forthright, dynamic woman. And what I loved about our conversation was there was an opportunity for me to be in a tender, loving power with her. There was an opportunity for me to be tender, sweet, and vulnerable with her, as there was for her with me. And just back to your acknowledgement of the dance between the masculine and the feminine, and how that can ebb and flow and intertwine. And there's so much beauty to it. And, within all of that, my journey with Sasha started 5 years ago, where I'm in Bali, so I'm exposed to a lot of alternative modalities for an exploration of this human experience outside of intellectualized aspect of mind. And Sasha and I touched upon sensitivity and distracting ourselves from the felt sense. And the way that we're living in the world today is so busy, so distracted, so productivity driven, so achievement focused, so competitive. Certainly the society I left was. And within all that, there isn't that opportunity just to slow down for a moment and just check in and see what is actually happening in our experiences. And we have to be able to pause, stop, gather ourselves, find our center, to find out what's going on in our bodies, what's actually happening in this indistinguishable mass of energy and emotion that's running through my system that I've never really stopped to consider. Energy and motion, energetic beings, spiritual beings. Well, how do we understand ourselves in life if we can't actually speak to and from our felt experience and report and show up from that place? So the dance of Sasha has really been around that. And why it was such a beautiful conversation for me was because my journey of embodiment and coming back into my sensitivity kind of started with Sasha when someone mentioned to me that she was here in Bali and I could go and have a bodywork session with her. And I'm like, well, what is bodywork? And so I look up a little bit about Sasha online, and I understand that there's something called a full-bodied orgasm for a man. Wait, what? Wait a second. What the hell is that? Well, that's a possibility for me. Well, if that's a possibility for me, I better go and have a look at that. And I'd been, struggling in and out of quote-unquote physical, sexual intimacy my whole life with women. I would have a pattern of being open-hearted and loving and sweet. And then if a woman got too close to me, unconsciously, inadvertently, I would shut down and run. And in my mind, I'd create a story that this just isn't right for me. I got it wrong. Time to move on. And this pattern would repeat throughout my life. And I would be hurting myself and other people in this process without realizing why and how and what I was doing. And then I had a woman got pregnant with me, and I had this little whisper that it was time to do some work and see what was in the way and what the obstructions and obstacles were. So I went to see Sasha, drove an hour and a half from the south coast of Bali up to Ubud to have a session with her. And we sat and spoke for an hour and a half about the work. And then I took my clothes off and I had a sarong ram and I lay on the bed, and she put her hands on me, but not on my body. She put her hands above my body, and she was moving energy with her presence and helping me to understand for the first time in my life that I am an energetic human being. I'm not a human doing who figures everything out from his head, but I'd never had any awareness because I'd run and led my whole life from my head. Sure enough, after 10, 15 minutes of her hands above my body moving the energy, started to experience extreme frustration, and my body started to move and convulse, and extreme rage and anger would come through, and underneath the anger and the rage would be a deeper sense of grief, and then shame for having grief, and fear and humiliation around my sexual identity and how I express myself sexually as a man. And I was there for 2.5 hours, and I cried, I laughed, I was mortified, I felt disgust, and it just peaked, and something opened up in me to realize that, hang on a second, I'm in a body as a man, or I've got a body as a man, but I'm not in my body. And what do I have to go and do to remember how to feel? And that's what's led to this work really now is coming to that realization that there isn't a lot of language and modeling for the full spectrum and expression of healthy emotionality in the world. And we want to create these spaces to model new ways of being for men, Angela.
I have never heard that story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that's deeply personal, and it's almost unimaginable. Like we don't talk about emotion in that way. Very few people have probably allowed themselves to be vulnerable enough to have an experience like that. Did that change everything for you going forward? Did that allow you to love in real life in different ways?
I was thinking last night, and I was thinking this morning about how to write down my life experience into a 18-minute synopsis summary so that I might be able to get up on stage and give a talk one day to put language around my experience. And the title that came through for my talk, even before I put pen to paper or finger to keyboard, is From Hatred into Love. Because, so to answer your question, coming back into the body after this experience meant that I had to go back and experience everything that I'd shut my body down to back in the day when I was a child and in my conditioning. And there was an enormous amount of fear and grief. And what I come to see, with my own struggles with my own fear and anxiety and the mild to moderate depression that I experienced most of my life, was I was pushing away and repressing and denying the most reprehensible aspects to myself. And I had to go back and experience, acknowledge, and admit how much I'd hated myself from a very, very, very young age, that I'd been projecting out of me inadvertently onto friends, women, whole swathes of people external to me without my awareness, even my young daughter. As a result of that process being kicked off with Sasha and my journey back into, let's say, emotional sobriety and this body gradually thawing from the iceberg of numbness that it had been, this frozen mass of energy, is that one day I was asking myself a question about my triggers with my sweet 7-year-old daughter and my irritability, my impatience, my resentment at times. And what is it about this sweet, sweet little girl that bothers me so much? And I'm on my scooter coming back from having lunch with someone, and I asked myself the question, do I in some way resent having my daughter? Nope, it's not that. Do I regret having her in some way because it's curtailed my happy-go-lucky, reckless, carefree spirit? No, it's not that. And then this thought emerges. Shit, could I admit that I feel hatred towards the being that I love most in the world? And I had to entertain that thought because it was so reprehensible. So I allowed it to arise, and And the more I welcomed and embraced that thought, the more it became real. And then I started to cry as I realized that there were kernels of truth to that repressed thought. And I let it come, and it got bigger and bigger. And I was sobbing on my scooter with this image of my sweet little daughter with her pigtails and her green eyes in my mind's eye. And then as it grew and grew and grew, at some moment there was this like, boom. And I came through this thought. Out the other side, image of my daughter disappeared. And I realized that it was my own self-hatred, that I'd been unable to see it. And so I got home and I got into the fetal position and I sobbed and 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 sobbed. And then I started to laugh because I'd felt through it. And because of my own denial or abdication of responsibility for my own experience, I've been projecting that out onto the world. And so for me, the journey back into self-love, the journey back into reconnection with the inner child, which for me, as I'm beginning to understand, is my true spirituality, my spontaneity, my joy, my kindness, my compassion. For me, it was a journey through hatred back into self-love. I hope that in some way answers the question, because I realize, what I'm seeing, Angela, I'm on an island in Indonesia, but, with social media, I get snippets of exposure to the mainstream conversation and how much infighting there is and how much blame, how much hatred, how much violence between the genders. And what does ownership of our own integrated psychological and emotional aspects look like to bring about healing? Rather than joining the conversation with the fuel of that energy, how can we use the fuel of the energy out there and see the obstacle being the way and start to have conversations from the inside out where I can take my responsibility for those unknown aspects of myself. And then you and I and others can come at this conversation from the inside out with just utter appreciation, reverence, love, acceptance, apology, forgiveness, and change the direction of the conversation to one of healing and hope.
It's really beautiful. And I have said to my audience and to my clients all along, the greatest love is to learn to love yourself. If you can become a good parent to yourself and recognize the child within you or the angry adolescent within and hold the space for those parts like you did and hold that thought or hold that feeling until you see what is actually behind that feeling of hatred. It's not your daughter at all.
Exactly.
It's that you had built up for all of those years, not allowing yourself to express your emotions. And there were so many moments in your episode with Sasha, and I would recommend that everybody go and listen to that. I don't want to recreate that here, but these two stories that you've just so generously shared with us, because it takes a lot of courage to be that vulnerable. it just points out why so many men, especially, are scared to go there. And I talk about doing that inner work. And it's really the path to everything else you want. It's the path to authentic love and companionship. And what I really loved about what she said in the episode, and I've said all along, is I can surrender to you when I understand that you are surrendered. As you're doing this work, you're becoming more and more surrendered to God or the spirit of life or love or whatever that is for you. But you become a man that can be trusted. And I'm sure that the men in your life sense that in you and your partner or your daughter.
You know, it's so interesting you say that. So here's the thing, as men, we feel fear. As men, we feel shame. As men, we feel guilt. As men, we feel sadness. And that's all okay. We also feel anger. We also feel pride. We also feel hatred, as we've touched on. We also feel courage. We also feel love. We also care deeply. We also feel peace, love, bliss, ecstasy. So we are availed of all of these emotional experiences. And you talk to the trust piece. Well, let's say I, as a man, I'm up against something, and rather than talking around it or finding confusion in the inability to articulate that, I can say, Angela, I'm not sure quite what's happening right now in my experience, but something big is occurring. I may not even have the language to understand how I'm feeling or what I'm feeling in the moment, but I'm going to feel it and I'm going to stay with it. I'm going to turn towards it. And can you be patient with me as I learn about myself and remember who I truly am before society and ideas of masculinity conditioned out my ability to express myself in its fullness? Would that be okay with you? I'm feeling quite a lot of fear right now. You can trust me if I'm reporting to you what's happening to me rather than going into my head and avoiding the situation. You have an intuitive gift, I suspect, where you can understand exactly where I am better than I can myself, often at times as I start this brave journey back into feeling. And for me, that's something I've understood. I try to protect other people by not being honest. What I'm really trying to say by that is I've tried to protect myself from feeling really uncomfortable feelings by not reporting them. Showing up as a man and learning how to trust myself as a man and have other people trust me around me is to be fully honest, open and vulnerable in any moment as I become more availed of and the ability to be with my experience and not be carried away by emotions, but have a degree of mastery over them.
I love that you said that. And one thing that I really loved about Sasha, like you said, she's this really powerful, feminine lady that is able to express that balance. I think a lot of people go too far over in their emotionality and they become sort of feminine with it. And she's very direct in saying that you're the guardian of the galaxy. You're meant to be a king. Now, get up and do that work also. But the way you do that is that dance between the masculine doing and the feminine intuition or being. And I feel like you do that work in your own heart, and then you do that work with people outside of you as well. And as I said earlier, that surrender, you did a post that said, women, can you trust us as we grow, as we develop? And I told you that there's the great mother part of me was very emotional reading that. And I thought to myself, seeing those beautiful men that were giving their story, I could do this work for the rest of my life. This is exactly where I want to be. I want to be a helper here. I want to have these conversations. I want to help men who want to heal. I want to help them do that and become the king that they are meant to be. But also there was a little part of me kind of shyly in the corner saying, I can't trust that. Because of the world that we live in where we're pitted against each other, it's going to take a lot of patience. It's going to take a lot of doing that work of allowing myself to see your inner child and you allowing yourself to see my inner child and us having patience with those parts.
Yeah.
And sometimes I might be the one that says, hey, it's okay, it's safe. And then sometimes you might be the one. The topic that I've been on lately is pornography. And the reason why is because I think it's just a way to numb, just like food is a way to numb. And when we feel sad or lonely or vulnerable, we try to numb those feelings. And I think pornography is so prevalent and so easily accessible. And I think it's really diminishing the connection between men and women, because I can opt out of a real relationship with a real woman. I feel like it strips that will to try, and it strips that desire, which is so important in that relationship. I think that's why I wanted to talk to you about returning to that place of authenticity and putting aside some of those things that were shackling you and keeping you from getting to that authentic place.
Pornography is a really interesting one. I had a conversation with Robert Masters the other day on the podcast around the eroticizing of a core wounding. Certainly, when I discovered pornography at 14 years old, it was such a revelation. It was a revelation because it was more than a numbing. What it did is it took me away into this hedonistic escape from the mild to moderate depression that I felt as a teenager and the anxiety I felt. It was an escape. It was wonderful if I go back into the teenage boy who's just discovering his sexual energy and his ability to feel that pleasure. But over the years and with the impressions that it communicates, is that, as I shared the other day, is that it creates an image and a movie in the mind's eye of what sexuality, sexual relating, intimacy, sex is. And that's in my head. So whatever's in my head is taking me away from the experience I'm in with a woman when I'm actually being with a woman. And I didn't realize this till I met Sasha, and still been an unraveling for me, that experience. It takes me out and away from connection, what's actually present and there between me and a woman, between a man and a woman. And what happens if you completely slow down so that whatever is present is present? And what if lovemaking wasn't necessarily the copulation, the penetration, the sex, but it was so much more? It was the dance that you spoke about at the top of the conversation, allowing energies to naturally move and jive, maybe tender at one moment, maybe passionate, ravishing at another moment, followed by some tenderness, some tears, followed by some laughter, followed by some intensity, just to move with the energy. For it not to be about friction-based sensation, which is what pornography is teaching men. It's all about the size and the performance of his penis rather than dropping into that sensitivity and not allowing oneself to be distracted. And how do the energies dance? What then is possible? And then this comes back to the whole male body orgasm conversation that we spoke about. It is possible. And there are videos that Sasha's put on YouTube around the male body orgasm. Now, until that comes into a man's awareness, he's going to constantly think that he has to have friction-based sex, ejaculate in order to achieve an orgasm. Not true. So ejaculation and orgasm are not mutually exclusive. Quite the opposite. What came to my awareness, and books can be read by Mantak Chia, and you can follow Sasha, and you can see another man called Shantam Nityama who's teaching around this, is that the male body is capable of extraordinary pleasure if the energies are redirected. If one person is willing to take the time to get to know their energies and how it moves and how it dances with the feminine, we can open our minds up to a type of lovemaking and a sexuality and an energetic exchange that hitherto was unknown to us. So it's been quite a revelation of, for me, and still patiently getting to know myself and my partner and what is actually there in any given moment, and then becomes very, very healing, Angela.
The previous episode before this one, we talk about how everybody's conditioned to do sex a certain way based on this whole generation watching porn and seeing how it's done. And that was one of the things I loved about your conversation with Sasha, how she talked about how the bodies were meant to to complement each other, and just the beautiful feeling of being free to not have to perform, to be able to be safe with her and be soft, and to allow it to progress from that point. And I thought about how we're conditioned to look at that as sort of a failure. A man is conditioned to believe that's a failure if he doesn't have a strong erection.
Yeah, it's crazy. And misunderstandings of growing up as teenage boys becoming men. How do we establish ourselves? How do we be perceived as, again, I can speak only to my personal experience, but going away to boarding school, how did I establish myself in the hierarchy of boys growing up? Well, what I did is I betrayed myself from a very early age because I always was a very sweet, sensitive, highly intuitive and feeling boy. And I was teased for that. And being teased for being who I was very, very, very painful. And being bullied for who I was very, very, very painful. So with my hypervigilance, I quickly singled out who were the groups of strength that I had to join in order to avoid being the butt of their targeted abuse, let's say. So I became them in order to protect myself. And in the becoming them, I also then became that which I feared. And I adopted the posture of a bully in my life without being aware of it for a very, very long time. And I hurt people by trying to protect myself, which again is a paradox. But this creation of a false self and denial of self created an extraordinary mental and emotional struggle in my life because I didn't know who I was because I created these false selves around me. And so then pornography comes in and with it a complete and utter forgetting of what the body's natural intelligence will show us if we'll just allow it. If we get the mind out of the way, the body never lies. It's the mind that's creating all of the issues. So, hearing Sasha speak about how the vagina will invite a penis when it's ready, and that a soft penis entering a vagina is preferred by the body, so that the woman's body can tell the penis when it's ready to be received, so that it can then grow into its fullness energetically and naturally complement the two bodies as they're coming together in convergence, goes against everything that we've ever been taught as men. So to be in a situation and hear that experience as a group of men is mind-blowing. Wait, what? You can hear the palpable sighs of relief from men who may be struggling with this idea to perform, whether that be with their ability to get an erection on demand or with premature ejaculation. And then what's been amazing for me is the number of women who've reached out to me to say that they yearn to be with a man in his softness. They yearn to be with a man who will allow them to see him in his tender vulnerability, and how few men they've met in their lives are able or willing to do that because of the amount of shame around their sexuality. I was moved to tears when one woman wrote to me along those lines. I feel somewhat like I'm standing on an island sometimes, Angela, like having this conversation and thinking of the mainstream energy and thought around this. But I'm determined to have the conversation, and it's that sort of thing. My wound is where the light enters. So my coming out of the closet moment is this, which is speaking openly and vulnerably around my own sexuality and my insecurities that kept me so unhappy for so long, in the knowledge that I'm freeing myself from my own shame, and maybe it can help some other men along the way.
Well, I certainly appreciate it. Just getting curious about, at first it started as a sadness. I mean, walking around in public, seeing couples together, wondering, are they actually having sex? And believing that they're probably not, because I've sat with so many people who are telling me that they're not having sex. When you hear it described in the beautiful way that you and Sasha talked about, it's just this coming together and really ministering healing to each other and creating that energy circuit. And then that sort of healing love flows out. I don't think it's that off base to say that great sex could heal the world. That
100%, yeah.
Giving and receiving of love in such an authentic, real way, I liked the way you talked about the differences, like the woman's positive pole is her heart and a man's positive pole is the penis. And when those two come together, that's where that circuit is. And that was like a revelation. And I can't believe I'm this many years old learning about some of the things I've learned since I just started to get curious. And it's...
Well, exactly. And like, how exciting to have someone articulate that awareness to us and be like, wow, that makes total sense. And
Yeah, it does.
what I love about what Sasha said is how men think that women are the same as men. Because a man's positive pole is in his genitals. He's inclined to go straight to a woman's genitals in order to seek arousal because that's the way he works.
Yeah.
No, incorrect. A woman is more likely to go and want to hug and kiss a man on his chest because she feels that that's where that she becomes most aroused. No. So acknowledging and recognizing our differences and supporting one another in that is magical. And let's speak in very general terms here. Men get a very, very bad rap for their oversexed nature, are constantly looking to have sex with multiple partners. And how many men are aware that that's the way they access their heart is through their positive pole and their genitals? And what they're actually seeking is true intimacy and love through their penises into their heart. That just blew my mind. And it gave me permission to stop looking at my sexual desire with shame and judgment and fear and guilt, because all I was ever seeking was connection to my heart. And how beautiful, with that awareness, is the gift of man to woman and woman to man. For healing, like you say, for closing that circuit. We were designed to be with one another, not to fight and hate against each other.
Yeah, and even outside of pornography, it seems like culturally everything is about that division. Even the music, like in the 90s, we had the boy bands that were crooning about "I'll make love to you," and now we have this harder, the worst lyrics imaginable that we couldn't have even imagined in the 90s with the boy bands. But I just feel like we've all become sort of performative. Nobody's getting their needs met, really.
It's a funny thing when you've been lonely and isolated for so long that you don't realize that you're lonely and isolated. So it becomes a default conditioning, and we think we're connected. What I realized with the circles and the spaces that we're creating for men to come together is that friendships that were commonplace in our childhood are being rediscovered and unearthed and recreated in our 40s. Men in our 40s who are coming together who've never met in the physical, coming together online for anywhere between 2 and 4 hours a month and sharing from their hearts. And friendships are being born in these spaces where we literally can't wait to get on a plane together from all over the world and meet in one place and hug, love, celebrate, and just encourage one another for the journey we're making. It's really beautiful. And so just back to the point about like isolation and disconnection to ourselves, because this to me is the whole conversation around intimacy and emotional intelligence and articulating and languaging and being able to express ourselves in a healthy way. Intimacy starts within. So how can I know the fullness of my own experience before then I can go and then share that with another human being? Because if I'm not in my body, you and I can in no way connect at any other level that is in some way superficial. So I've got to be able to know myself in order to be able to connect with you in a meaningful way. So that's what we're hoping to model and teach and show men of my generation. But also, I'm a long way removed from the education system, the schooling system, but my strong sense is to create spaces for young boys coming up and out into the world where emotion and sensitivity and languaging of this emotional experience is celebrated, so that we can create a new generation of young folk who are going into the world leading from their hearts rather than their minds, and how that might contribute to a more compassionate world.
You guys talked about two different aspects of men. One is the mother, and how so many women aren't really taught to be a mother. They're not taught that gradual release, like you're basically working yourself out of a job, because they actually come from within your body. They're connected to your body. And then at some point they leave you. And how do you let go of that control? How do you do that gradually? And so many men are dealing with that smothering mother. And then when they try to find examples of men, they see the worst examples, greed or men who take advantage of women. And so they cower away from that as well. For you to be allowing yourself to be so vulnerable and to tell the truth that I became that which I despised in order to survive. And then your whole life now, you're living this redemption story, and your vulnerability and your honesty and you setting an example of this new kind of man to be, I think it will set people free. It will give people the courage to have their own journey, their own redemptive journey, to go from that man that they despise, they became to survive, to becoming an authentic man who is a king, a benevolent king on the earth.
Yeah, I love the way you worded that and articulated that. It's a blessing to be in this conversation with you, Angela, and something beyond me is leading me to this conversation. And if I hadn't experienced, if I'm just really honest with you, it's like if I hadn't experienced so much pain and suffering and despair and apathy and self-hatred, I either would have taken my life or I would be on this path with you now. And so it's not that I didn't have a choice, it's that I had two choices. One was to escape the pain, and the other one was to turn towards the pain. And I chose to turn towards it by the grace of God, to have a look what was the other side. And with that decision, all sorts of incredible teachers and supporters and friends have fallen into my way to guide me, to guide the little boy in me that needed to be shown and to be taught. And so at 44 years old, it feels like a rite of passage, if you will, from a boyhood psychology into a healthy masculine psychology, as much as I can speak to that right now, because it's all still very new to me, and I'm learning and I'm growing. But I feel as though there's so many great men out there doing this work and supporting young folk and supporting men into it, that we can all add our voices to the conversation in ways that can touch people that need to hear it and can take steps. And we're doing our bit with the privileged man, and we welcome men to come forward and connect and be curious and learn a little bit more about themselves, because the rewards are untold. To feel love coursing through the body again, and the warmth and the connection and the compassion, and to feel the beauty in crying. My God, it's like unknotting a kink in a hose, just allowing it to flow, and then feeling that energy of love move through again. It's such a salve. It's like an ointment. It's very restorative and very healing, because it's love at the end of the day. It's love.
Yeah, and when people hear me say love is the answer, I mean, it sounds so hippie and so hearts and flowers, and it's not. It's brutal. Love is brutal. Getting to the point where you have an open channel to give and receive love, there's so much pain and suffering that you have to endure to knock off all those barnacles, all of that learned behavior. When you reach that stage of life where you choose to cut it off, or you choose to open up and become that gift of life and be that source of life for other people, I think that's the greatest love of all. And I respect your journey and appreciate you.
Thank you. And you, Angela, thank you so much for saying that. And Hafiz was said to have said, and your separation from God is the hardest work you will ever do. And if God is love, well then our separation from love is the hardest work we'll ever do. And so you're spot on. I share your declaration that love is the answer. But my God, yeah, when you're cleaning out the hose that's become rusty and barnacled, hang on, buckle up for the ride.
Yeah.
And, speaking to that, it's like, buckle up for the ride and realize that you've made a choice and you can get help along the way, because there are a lot of us who are walking this path, who have walked this path, that can speak to and hold you and love you as you go through your own journey of apathy, despair, self-hatred, grief. That is part of the process. To normalize language around mental and emotional health, this is the human experience we're talking about here. You're not alone. You need not suffer in silence, and we'll love each other through it, men and women alike. I'm really interested to be in spaces with women too, as a man, to hear of the depth of the pain and the suffering, and to witness it, to understand it, to see how we men have played our part in it, for women to understand how women have played their part in men's suffering, just to see each other in that, forgive one another in that, and allow love to do what love does, I think will be hugely, hugely powerful, because we're all responsible here. This is the point.
Yes.
It's not men or women or women or men. We're all in it together. We're all fathers. We're all mothers. It's not our fault that we got here, but it's our responsibility to change.
Yes. That's a really beautiful vision of witnessing each other and walking each other toward that healing. I love that.
Yeah.
Because we can intellectually hear, but to really get centered with someone and allow yourself to, like we said before, witness those childlike parts or witness those adolescent parts that made those really terrible decisions to abandon themselves to survive. To witness that in each other is such a healing process.
Yes, it is.
Well, I, again, recommend everybody check out that episode you did with Sasha Cobra. And can you tell people where they can get in touch with you or reach you if they'd like to find out more about The Privileged Man?
Absolutely, Angela. www.theprivilegedman.com is where men can come and find spaces to remember the language of their hearts. On Instagram, @theprivilegedman is a page we're building out there with all the podcast conversations. And my Instagram is @Esmond Baring, ESMOND BARING. Yeah, please come and join us and be a part of this conversation. If I can lend my voice in any way, shape, or form, consider it offered. And thank you so much, Angela, for this space and this time to dance with you. And thank you for all that you're doing and that great mother energy that's coming through you. I really appreciate that in you too. It's been lovely.
Thank you so much, Esmond.